All right. Hello. Welcome, everybody. We're so glad to have you here. So first of all, welcome to the inaugural Honest Reporting Canada educational webinars. Many of you I recognize. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Robert Walker. I am the new Marketing and Community Relations Associate for Honest Reporting Canada. I see many familiar names. I was going to say familiar faces, but hopefully not too much longer in the future. And of course, we are very, very pleased to have Dr. Einat Wilf here today. We're so happy to have you here. You're going to give me carpal tunnel syndrome accepting all of these people, but thank God we have a full house here today, and I think that speaks to the caliber and the quality of our speaker. So, really, first, before I begin, I'm just going to make sure everybody, if you can have yourself muted. Like I said, I believe that we've had you muted already, but just to make sure that that's the case. For security reasons, you will not be able to unmute yourselves. At least that's the case. And to share your screen. I know that Zoom bombing has been an issue elsewhere. So if you do have any questions, you can always direct a message to me, Honest Reporting Canada. Failing that, if that's not working, you can also email me, robert@honestreporting.ca, if you have any questions or technical issues and so on. So really, let's jump right into it. I want to introduce again our speaker, Dr. Einat Wilf. She is the co-author of The War of Return: How Western Indulgences of the Palestinian Dream Have Obstructed the Path for Peace. And she is a leading intellectual and an original thinker on matters of foreign policy, economics, education, Israel, and Zionism. Dr. Wilf was a member of the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, from 2010 until 2013, where she served as chair of the Education Committee and a member of the influential Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. She's considered one of Israel's most articulate representatives on the international stage, and again, we're in for quite a treat today. In the past, Dr. Wilf has served as a senior fellow at the Jewish People Policy Institute, the Bay Foundation, the adjunct fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, foreign policy advisor for Vice Prime Minister Shimon Peres, and a strategic consultant with McKinsey and Company. She has a bachelor's from Harvard University, an MBA from INSEAD in France, and a PhD in political science from the University of Cambridge. Born and raised in Israel, she served as an intelligence officer in the Israel Defense Forces. She's the author of 6 books that explore key issues in Israeli society, including My Israel, Our Generation, about Israel's younger generation, Back to Basics, How to Save Israeli Education at No Additional Cost, It's Not the Electoral System, Stupid, Winning the War of Words, that compiles her key essays on Israel and Zionism, and her most recent books are Telling Our Story, a collection of Wilf's essays on Israel, and of course, The War of Return. And today, really, we'll be talking primarily about her latest book, and we're really, really excited about that. So again, without further ado, Dr. Wilf, so glad to have you join us.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here, and what a wonderful crowd. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. So first of all, briefly tell us what life is like in Israel. I think everybody here primarily is watching from Canada or the States. We're all envious of, the tremendous job that Israelis have done keeping COVID at bay. Tell us what life is like there.
So far, so good. So Israel has done well. We're pretty much gone back almost to normal, at least within Israel. There are barely any flights. Of course, no one is coming in. But within Israel, we're almost back to normal, except for large gatherings. We're monitoring potential new cases. But for now, it seems to be at bay, but remains to be seen. I mean, it's clearly not over.
Wonderful. Well, listen, I think it's moving in the right direction. This will be with us for a while, but we're happy to see that Israel is, as with everything else, on the front lines and showing the rest of the world how to get things done. So, so we're here really. I want to talk about your book, The War of Return: How Western Indulgences of the Palestinian Dream Has Obstructed the Path to Peace. So, for those of us who are intrigued but haven't yet gotten it, it was just available end of April. Is that correct?
Yes.
Perfect. So tell us what the main thesis of the book is. That we can, I think, get an idea from the title there. But what's the ichor? What's the main thrust?
So the book is kind of a political and historical whodunit, and almost certain mystery when you look for certain suspects. The book tries to answer a very simple question: how do we get here? Why do we not have peace? How is it that from a war that ended over 7 decades ago, we have millions of Palestinians who claim to have a so-called sacred right to settle inside the sovereign state of Israel. And the book really emerges from my experience growing up in Israel and very much being in the Israeli peace camp. I worked with Yossi Beilin, the architect of the Oslo Accords, with Shimon Peres. I was a member of the Labor Party in the Knesset. And I was a staunch believer in what was known as the path to peace for decades, which was this very simple formula that basically was known as land for peace. Israel will hand over land, which it acquired as a result of the Six-Day 1967 war, and in return, it should expect to get the peace that eluded it since its foundation. And I was one of those kids they took out in first grade to wave the flags for Anwar Sadat's motorcade when he came to the Israeli Knesset in Jerusalem. So the peace agreement with Egypt was really the first and massive land for peace success story. I mean, we can have an interesting discussion more than 40 years after that agreement, whether what we have with Egypt today is peace. But this was considered the success of land for peace, and a lot of land. The Sinai Peninsula was twice the size of Israel. In the 1990s, I mean, I was part, and we, certainly in the Israeli peace camp, were part of the global euphoria of the end of history. Look, previously unimaginable things were happening in just quick succession. The Soviet Union disappeared. Eastern Europe became free. Apartheid in South Africa came to an end. Northern Ireland signed a peace agreement. I mean, hey, why not for us too? And the 1990s were really this end of history moment also for us. We negotiated with Syria over the Golan Heights. We signed a peace agreement with Jordan. And of course, the highlight was we negotiated with the Palestinians over the future of the West Bank and Gaza. And the sense really was like, we're employing land for peace. We're going to have peace, and it's going to be the end of history for us. And when in 2000, Barak goes to Camp David, which of course is very symbolic, this is where the land for peace with Egypt was negotiated, he offers the Palestinians everything we were told they wanted. I mean, he checked all the boxes. Today, people take it for granted, but at the time, that was truly bold. Basically, the Palestinians were going to get a state fully sovereign in the West Bank and Gaza. No settlements. So settlements were not going to be an issue. They were either going to be dismantled or exchanged for equivalent land. There was going to be an end to the occupation, of course. They were going to get a capital in East Jerusalem, including in the Old City, holy sites. So this checked all the boxes. All they had to do was say, yes, we'll take it. But they walk away. Arafat walks away. President Clinton puts Barak's proposal into a series of parameters. They reject it. In 2008, Abu Mazen walks away from a similar proposal by Olmert, even bolder in some respects, but the same principles. And they do not just walk away, they follow it with just bloody mayhem and a campaign of violence and suicide bombings. And people like me and Adi Schwartz, my co-writer, who's from the peace camp, a senior editor and journalist for Haaretz, asked a simple question: where's our peace? We were willing to give over the land. Where's our peace? And this is where the book begins, as this kind of whodunit. And what's amazing, I'll take you to the end and say, what we realize is that the suspect was hiding in plain sight. We had the answer all along, right? This is how good whodunit books are. The answer was there all along. We just refused to listen. The Palestinians told us what they wanted. And what they wanted is not what Barak offered them. What they wanted is the same thing they've always said they wanted: an Arab-Palestinian Palestine from the river to the sea. And this idea, the way to reach it, was encapsulated in this demand for a right of return. And just so we understand what that means, it means that millions of Palestinians, the Palestinians count millions of refugees, who by now, of course, are all the descendants of the original refugees displaced by war. They claim that all those millions possess a sacred right, which of course there's no such right, but they believe they possess it, to settle inside the state of Israel, not in the West Bank and Gaza. Many of the refugees are in the West Bank and Gaza. That's not what they want. And the numbers are such that if they realize this right of return, Israel becomes an Arab Palestinian state with a Jewish minority. So when Palestinians, even during the heyday of Oslo and the negotiations, said that they support a two-state solution, but continued to insist that the right of return is sacred and possessed by every Palestinian refugee into perpetuity, including all the generations, then the only two states they ever envisioned as bringing peace was a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza and another Palestinian state to replace Israel. There has not yet been a vision of peace based on the notion that Israel gets to stay as it is. And this is basically the main thesis of the book, that for the Palestinians, the right of return is the most important thing, more important than statehood, more important than ending the occupation. Of course, they want all these things, but not so much as to forgo the most important thing, which to them is this right of return.
Wow. Okay. So a lot to unpack there. So if I'm understanding, really, what you're saying is that the model, the template, so to speak, for peace that was established previously with Egypt and with Jordan was this land for peace that was that has proven, if not perfectly, then as to paraphrase your words, at least passably for the interim. So, but what's happening, just want to make sure I understand correctly, but what's happening here is that, sort of the international community looked at Jordan and they looked at Egypt and they looked at the peace agreements, even if it was a cold peace, and they said, listen, this land for peace worked, huge lands, it worked. Why couldn't it work here, with Israel and the Palestinians? But according to the book, it hasn't worked, primarily because of the sticking point of the law of return, or sorry, not the law of return, this right of return rather, which is the Palestinians have said, well, listen, we want the 3-4 million descendants of the original refugees to be able to return to the land of Israel rather, and that's really the crux of the issue today. Is that an accurate representation?
Yes, and it even goes to the beginning, the idea of the return. I mean, we try to investigate where did this idea even come from, because we compare the Palestinian refugees to all other refugees throughout the 20th century. We show that they did not return, that they did not have a right of return. So we try to understand why are millions of Palestinians deeply believing that they possess this right, where no other refugees in the world have this right, had it, and still insist on it after several decades. And we realized that it goes back, I mean, the right of return was basically, to paraphrase Clausewitz, the continuation of war by other means. I mean, for them, if I were to kind of say it very simply, why do we have millions of refugees from a war that ended more than 7 decades ago? The simple answer is because from the Palestinian perspective, the war is not over. The war has never been over. When they look at 1948, they don't view it as a war that ended, as a file that closed. So as far as they're concerned, the fact that they lost in 1948 is temporary. As far as they're concerned, they can still win the Great War. What is the Great War? The war against Zionism, the war against the establishment of a sovereign Jewish state in any part of the land. Initially, they thought they could win the war with the help of Arab armies in 48 and in 67, and even in 73 in part. But then the Arab armies checked out, and then they thought terrorism and economic boycotts. And what remains really as the main path, as far as they're concerned, to victory is this idea of return. So the Palestinian right of return is not an innocent idea. It's not some negotiating thing. It's not on par with questions of settlement or occupation. It's the thing because it reflects their entire worldview that a sovereign state for the Jewish people in any borders is illegitimate. And the fact that such a state was established in the wake of the 1948 war is merely a temporary aberration, which will one day be undone, if not through violence, then through return.
So that really leads to the question of, is this this strategy then of, as you said, sort of continuation of war by other means, is this more a matter of principle? In other words, we continue to reject the legitimacy of the state of Israel, and more out of principle than anything else, this is the only tool we have? Or in their minds, is there a realistic possibility or plausibility of success in this method? In other words, do they really believe they're going to be successful, or is it more, this is the only arrow in our quiver, so we might as well use it?
It's a combination of both. I mean, often Adi and I speak to European diplomats about the book, about the thesis, about the fact that they're fueling it, right? A big part of the book is about how Western indulgence of this is fueling the conflict, is preventing peace. And almost all of them have the same answer. The Palestinians know that they're not returning. They're being delusional. It's not a realistic idea. It's a bargaining chip. Now, what we respond is we say, look, in this conflict, the Palestinians right now are not being irrational. They're opening a map, they're looking at the region, and they're saying, what? We have 7 million Jews amidst nearly 500 million Arabs, nearly 1.5 billion Muslims. This is not going to last. So when, in their view, the story of Israel is like the story of the Crusaders, like the story of the French in Algeria, I mean, basically a story of foreigners who came to a foreign land, they are, in their view, very rational to assume that this aberration in the history of the region, which since the 7th century is Arab and Islamic, will be corrected sooner or later. And they see no reason to compromise when they expect, in their mind, realistically, within a generation or even 5, to get the entirety of the land. And our argument is that unless one accepts that the Palestinians have something to rely on, they look at the map, they assume the support of the Arab and Islamic world, they see the support of the West, so they make a very rational choice to keep fighting because they say, okay, at one point, our persistence, will pay off. They will only seek compromise if they are led to believe that they have no choice, that the Arab world no longer supports them, and that the Western world no longer supports them. And when we get to the recommendations in the book, this is what we're basically saying. We're saying if we are ever to get to peace, and a peace that allows Israel to stand as is, because the Palestinians have a vision of peace where Israel disappears. But if we're ever to have peace where Israel is allowed to stand as is, the Palestinians must understand that their vision of Palestine from the river to the sea is not indulged, that they no longer have neither Arab nor Western support for it. But right now, it's interesting that actually Arab support is beginning to come down, but they still have massive Western support. And our argument is, as long as this support is expressed financially, intellectually, legally, then they're not going to compromise ever.
So, so interesting you just mentioned there that basically that the West, I just want to make sure I'm understanding. On one hand, you're saying that the Western world has moved away from, explicitly supporting that, but would it be accurate to say they're, in other words, help me understand here. In your view, do the Western powers historically, I don't mean, one administration or another coming and going, but, historically over the last, say, 53 years since the Six-Day War, how have they indulged this right of return? In other words, have they been telling Palestinian Authority, we believe that you can have 4 million, Palestinians return to the land of Israel, or percentage of them, or is it more sort of indirect where they sort of just drag them along because they want a seat at the table?
So the ones that are beginning to move away from the support for return are actually Arab countries, not Western countries. That's the interesting development in the last few years, especially Saudi and Gulf states are beginning to voice, actually openly voice views that basically tell the Palestinians it's over. 1948 is over, move on. Now, this message of it's over, move on, is the message that all refugees in the world received throughout the 20th century. The 20th century is a century rife with refugees as a result of the transition from empires to nation states. Across Asia and Africa and Europe, you have tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of refugees. Are they refugees today? No, because they all got the same message. It's sad, it's tragic, you lost your home, but move on. And they all moved on. They moved on to build new lives wherever they were in their new countries or in new places. And they may have been nostalgic for their previous lives, but they didn't sit in refugee camps on the border seething with revenge and waiting decades to take back their land, which is what the Palestinian condition is. And the reason that the Palestinians have this situation is that after 1948, basically, the West caves into Arab pressure to keep the war of 1948 open. And the West caves in basically by funding a temporary agency called UNRWA that keeps alive this idea that generation after generation, Palestinians are still refugees. Now, when we speak to European diplomats, they generally reject our claim that by financially supporting UNRWA, and the West gives about $1 billion to UNRWA every year, that by financially supporting UNRWA, they are politically supporting the Palestinian idea of a right of return. But our argument, and in that sense, the Palestinians are correct, is that you cannot financially support an organization for 70 years and then wash your hands when the recipients of the financial support view your financial support as political support. The Palestinians, in my view, correctly interpret the Western financial support to UNRWA, and Canada is the major funder, of course, as political support for the right of return. And the West is doing nothing to tell them otherwise. You do not see declarations by Western countries that tell the Palestinians, enough, it's over, the war's 48 is over, move on, you're not really refugees, and there's no such thing as a right of return into another sovereign country. So the West is entirely silent on this issue and actively financially supporting the agency that keeps alive this. So this is how the West continues to fuel the Palestinian vision of Palestine from the river to the sea.
So tell me then, why is it that Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states have moved on when European and other Western, including Canada, haven't? Is it just geopolitics vis-a-vis Iran? What's driving it?
So last decade, a lot of things happened in the Arab world, the so-called Arab Spring, Iran, Israel continued to demonstrate its economic, military, financial power. So all of these things together brought the countries of the Gulf mostly to look at Israel and to say, you know what, we're ready to close the file of 1948. We're ready to begin to part ways. And for me, this is the most interesting development. We're beginning to part ways from the idea that to be Arab is to be anti-Zionist. I mean, an Arab identity can stand and does stand on its own without having anti-Zionism be a primary element of it. But for at least 7 decades, to be Arab meant to be an anti-Zionist. But as a result of geopolitics and interests, the Arab world, and certainly the Gulf countries, no longer view it that way. And what's interesting is that they're beginning to change the narrative. They're not just talking about interests. They're not saying things like, look, we still hate Israel, but we need to cooperate with it. They're beginning to take actions, whether it's a TV series or op-eds or clerics going on TV and saying things. Why are we against Israel? Islam accepts all 3 scriptures, and even memes that were recently put on social media that basically criticize Palestinians for being eternally rejectionists. Now, we need to understand the Palestinians at the end of the day are a small people. If it was truly only an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it would have been over in 1948. The reason that it continued for so long is because the Arab world was interested in it, and it forced the West to cave in. When the Arab world is no longer, or some of it is beginning to lose interest in keeping the file of 1948 open, there is really no reason for the West to keep it open. This is what amazingly, instinctively, Trump understood. When President Trump decided to pull out all the UNRWA funding, the US funding for UNRWA, and for decades, America was the #1 funder of UNRWA, he realized that when Eisenhower had to cave in the 50s to Arab pressure because of oil and the fear of them going to the Soviet orbit and all of that, he instinctively realized that there will not be repercussions, that the same repercussions that would have been in the 50s are no longer relevant. And this is one of our arguments. There is literally no basis for the West to keep feeding this Palestinian rejectionism when some in the Arab world are beginning to move away from it, and where there are clearly no longer geopolitical repercussions for doing so.
So my question really is, so what is driving it then? I mean, why do not European, diplomats in Brussels and elsewhere look and say, listen, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, they're moving away from this. What are we still doing here?
So first of all, this is fairly new, so I think it will take time. The other part is, by now, this has been a structure erected for 7 decades. Sometimes when Adi and I leave those meetings with European diplomats deeply exhausted, we say to ourselves, oh my, we have to undo 70 years of lies. I mean, during these 70 years, an entire infrastructure was placed that created for so many the worldview that Palestinians are indeed still refugees, and that they do possess a right of return, and that there's something unique about their situation, and that UNRWA is a humanitarian organization. I mean, lie after lie after lie, all of which we basically undo in the book. But it's a lot of work to undo these lies. And by now, it's a pretty massive structure. So I think it's a combination of inertia, of the fact that the change in geopolitics is fairly recent, and that I do think, if I may, there was a need for a book like our own to actually expose this 70-year scam.
So how concerned then is the Palestinian leadership when they see, like I said, these sort of their stalwart Arab, allies moving in one direction? In other words, do they look really more at the Arab states, or do they look at the trajectory of the European states when really trying to, hitch their wagon?
So of course they're concerned about the moving away of Arab states. You can even see it in their declarations. Part of the kind of the driving force behind the Gaza marches of return, right, under this theme of return, was to hopefully, they even said it, if you listen to the Hamas leaders, they said the idea was to drive a wedge against Arab normalization with Israel. You see that this is an issue of deep concern for them. Whenever they raise the issue of Al-Aqsa, they're turning to a lot of the old tricks in order to rally the Arab world behind their cause, with less and less success, because really the Arab world has so much on its plate. But for us, the greatest tragedy is really at this amazing moment when the Arab world is slowly moving away from decades of anti-Zionism, of tying the Arab identity to anti-Zionism. You see the West rushing in to fill the void and to keep saying, no, no, keep fighting. These are your rights. This is justice. And of course, for the Palestinians to move towards compromise, they need to understand that they have no support, not from the Arab world and not from the West.
So, so what would it take then, for this kind of public diplomacy that's taking place in Israel, and partially books like yours or your book, into European and other Western countries? I mean, what's it going to take to convince them that this is, a failed initiative here? Is it going to be that, listen, you're the last man standing here? Is it that there's no plausibility? I mean, I'm sitting here and I'm hearing this and I'm thinking, I don't understand how Western diplomats haven't gotten the idea that this just isn't going to happen. Regardless of even if all the Arab states were supporting it, I could understand if somebody virulently, detested Israel and said, listen, at one point we're going to come back. But how could a clear-headed, European diplomat look at the situation and say, yes, the right of return is a plausible ask? I mean, I don't understand that.
So it's a combination. I have to share with you. I think about a year or two ago, when the book came out in Hebrew, we went to meet with several diplomats in European capitals, and we went to Brussels, and we met with a European EU diplomat who's in charge of the UNRWA file and the EU funding, which is substantial to UNRWA. And Adi and I go through the history, and we explain, and really, I mean, very few diplomats know the history of UNRWA and the history of the Western caving in to fund UNRWA. So we go through all of it. And then at the end, he looks at us, and I'm going to do it at about the same pace that he said. He said, so you want to tell me that the reason that we still don't have peace is that the Palestinians want all of it? And Adi and I both go, yes. Now, this is a smart guy. He's on the file, but until the two of us sat there, it didn't even cross his mind that this is the issue, because it's so obvious to everyone that the problem is the settlements or the occupation. And those are not great things, but what we show is they're not the issue. And even when he individually is finally willing to consider that prospect, he's part of a massive system and a bureaucracy that is under this inertia for 7 decades and this mountain of lies. And the other phenomena, which I've even decided to name, I've invented a word that I call Westplaining. Everybody knows what mansplaining is by now, when men tell women what they think or what they ought to say. So Westplaining is the same idea. It's my word for when Western diplomats and journalists explain what Palestinians have just said. Palestinians will tell you, from the river to the sea, the right of return is sacred. We are never going to give it up. And then what does a Westerner say? They don't mean it. The march is for return in Gaza, right? They tell you what they're marching for. They want the land. They don't want independence for Gaza. They want Israel. They're telling you they're marching for return. What do Westerners say? It's a cry for help. It's about the conditions in Gaza. And I think one of the things our book does very well is we actually give the Palestinians the respect of taking them at their word. We treat them as agents of history. not some people who don't know what they're fighting for and what they're saying. And I think precisely because we respect them as agents of history who know what they're fighting for, we understand that they're not going to stop fighting for it unless they literally have absolutely no choice. But I think a lot in the West still have this West-plaining neo-colonial attitude that just refuses to take the Palestinians at their word and merely views this as some kind of something between a cry for help and a bargaining chip. And I just have to say on the bargaining chip thesis, it was okay in the 90s to think it's a bargaining chip, that they will bargain away when they finally get a chance to get the real asset of territory. But when they are offered it twice in 2000 and 2008, and what you find is that they bargain away the state so that they will not have to sign any agreement that forgoes the right of return, then it's time to put to bed the bargaining chip thesis. It's not the bargaining chip, it's the goal itself.
You know, it reminds me, there was something I was just reading of you today. You were talking about, you know, that often the Western world treats the Palestinian leadership as having no agency, you know, having no ability to decide for themselves. There's an expression that I love called the soft bigotry of low expectations, and it just reminds me of this. So let's move on then. I may ask you all day about this, but so what are the recommendations then? I mean, you know, you mentioned that a little bit in the beginning. What's the future, you know, hope?
So our recommendations is first and foremost, realize that this is the issue. Stop lying to yourself, stop West-plaining, understand that this is the issue. The Palestinian belief that all of the land is theirs and their notion that they are supported in their long war to get all of it. And right now, through the mechanism of the right of return. So first of all, understand that this is it. There's no other story here, hiding. This is it. It's very clear. And like we said, it's hiding in plain sight. You know, one of the first reviews that came out of the book was by a Palestinian. And it was a very angry review. And one of the things that he was most angry about in the book is that we describe this as hiding in plain sight or flying on the radar. His argument was basically, duh, I mean, what did you think we wanted? So as much as the book is, the review is angry, it actually confirms the thesis of the book, that this is what the Palestinians want. So first of all, listen to them, take them at their word, and understand that this is the issue, nothing else. Once you understand that, you can actually take steps to rectify it and to finally put us on a course or a path to peace, because for 70 years, you've been putting us on a course away from peace. And how do you do that? Is by moving the fuel, the kindle that lets Palestinians believe that they might one day win, that they will have return. Dismantle UNRWA. We show that the organization cannot be reformed. It has to be dismantled. And we show how. We give very specific recommendations, basically how to transfer its operations to other providers, basically end the charade that Palestinians are refugees. They're not. And the notion that they're refugees, make it clear to them that there is no such thing as a right of return to another sovereign country. When they have their own state, they're more than welcome to enact an immigration law. And if they want to copy Israel, they can call their immigration law the law of return, but it will be into their own state, not to another state. So make it clear to them that there's no right of return into the sovereign state of Israel. They are not refugees. Dismantle UNRWA. And our argument is that when all of that is done, you can then hope. There's no guarantee, but at least there's a far better chance that a Palestinian leadership can emerge that will accept the new conditions, that will understand that it no longer has a choice, and then you will have a leader that is ready for compromise. And the hope that we bring is in the story in the book of Willy Brandt, the German chancellor who told the German refugees from after World War II, the ones from Poland, from Czechoslovakia, who also wanted to return but were not indulged by the West for obvious reasons, that it's over. And we say in the book, literally take the Willy Brandt speech in 1970 to the German refugees when he signed a treaty with Poland, cut and paste the speech to a Palestinian leader, and we know that we're finally on the path to peace. But the chances of such a leader ever emerging will only exist if the Palestinians are bereft of all the support and fuel for the vision of return.
But what would happen? I mean, let's say that there was, a sea change in the West as a result of your book, and and this moves away, and Western diplomats move away from this, this enabling, this indulging of this Palestinian, dream of eradicating Israel. But from a practical perspective, how could any Palestinian leader stand in front of his or her, people who for the last 70 years have been told that the state of Israel is an aberration, it's going to be gone, and then say it's over? I mean, I can't imagine anybody you not surviving that in a realistic or at very least or at most convincing their people to accept that. So even if we convince Western diplomats, how does a Palestinian leader get their own people to buy into that?
Absolutely not tomorrow morning. I mean, in Germany, from the moment that the Germans were not indulged, where they were basically given the very tough message, and by the way, we have descriptions in the book of the German expulsions. I mean, those were really brutal. 12 million Germans, 2 million died in the process of expulsions. And they wanted their land back, they wanted return, but they were not indulged. They got a very clear message from the West, which is it's over and we don't care. You're not going back there. Even then, it took 25 years for Willy Brandt to finally sign an agreement with Poland, accept the final borders, and give that speech to his people. So we're saying, will it take 25 years, more, less? But all we can say is right now, there is zero chance of that happening because the ethos of the Palestinians is return and Israel is an aberration, and they believe that they are supported in that. Only once they have to come to terms with the fact that they're alone and they do not have support, that they have support for a constructive vision of building a state that lives in peace with Israel as is, but that they have no support for the vision of all of it is theirs, only then can you even begin to have such a leader emerge. And it will take a generation. Took a generation for Germany, but we don't know how long it will take. All we can say is right now the chances of that happening are zero, and we're at least recommending how to increase the chances of that happening.
Wow. Well, that's a lot. This has been tremendous. I really appreciate your time. I mean, this has been extremely thoughtful and edifying. And I think many of us in the pro-Israel world, look at what's happening, and we have been saying for many, many years as individuals, as communal leaders, that many of the Palestinian claims of having 4 or 5 million, for refugees or descendants of refugees return to the land of Israel would swallow up the Jewish state whole. And many of us have known that was a non-starter. But it's intriguing to know that that's being communicated on a higher level as well. So before we let you go, how can everybody go ahead and buy your book?
I think it's available on Amazon, or I'm not sure. Just check. I mean, especially these days when I don't know what's the situation of bookstores in Canada. I think the best way is either to download it as an ebook or Kindle version, or just order it home from Amazon or another site.
Okay, wonderful. Well, the book is The War of Return. Check on Amazon, or I'm sure Indigo as well, and I'm sure we can certainly find some copies. So thank you again very much, Dr. Wilf, for joining us. And again, this is being recorded, so hopefully we can have this up and running at HonestReportingCanada.ca, and make sure that everyone can watch it again at their leisure. Once again, on behalf of Honest Reporting Canada, Dr. Wilf, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, everybody else. Have a wonderful day, and like I said, we'll hope to have this recorded and sent out in due time. All the best.
Thank you. Thank you. This has been a pleasure.